This is a special series of Reality Check.
That South Africa is the most unequal society in the world.
While I'm waiting for radiation that can heal me, they're just taking their time.
We still don't have electricity, we still don't have water.
2/3 of all wealth earned since 2020 was earned by the world's richest 1%.
Stand-up had overstated profits over several years.
We are investing in our people.
Corruption.
I'm not going anywhere. President in a broken country.
They need to know we are fighting for our rights.
This is Reality Check.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of Reality Check with me, Thembekile Mrototo, where we talk about politics, culture, as well as economics. And that's going to be our focus for the next hour because there's an interesting report out, initially commissioned from the G20 finance ministers meeting that happened in February. That was chaired by the Brazilian presidency, basically. And from that was an interesting conversation around taxation for the super wealthy. That led then to the birth of the report that we're going to talk about today. One of the proposals, for instance, is a 2% tax for dollar billionaires. The idea from that is that ultimately, or the hope at least, that majority of countries around the world would adopt this. And if that happened, the expected benefit in dollar terms is about $200 to $250 billion. But as things stand, this is a report, a mere proposal maybe, and countries would ultimately be able to decide on how they implement it. And here to talk to us about this, one of the people we have is the man who actually put this together, Professor Gabriel Zucman. Now, let me tell you about Gabriel Zucman. He is Professor of Economics at Paris School of Economics and Associate Professor of Economics at the University of California, Berkeley. He's also the founding director of the EU Tax Observatory. We're also fortunate enough to have with us today Lebo Ramafoko, Executive Director at Oxfam South Africa, and Zimbali Mncube from the Institute for Economic Justice. He's a researcher in budget and tax policy there. And then later, you'll also be able to hear from our executive producer here on Reality Check, Ben Cashdan, and we'll be crunching some of the numbers around the scenarios where much of this tax could go, especially in South Africa, where we talk a lot about inequality and the need to take money, possibly from the wealthy, and use it for the benefit of the country, especially the poor. We know we are still the most unequal society in the world. So could this be the silver bullet that South Africa needs? But before we get to those questions, my thanks to all of you. Thank you so much for being with us. Gabriel, if I can start with you, why a tax on the wealthy and not income tax? Because this is a wealth tax and not income.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And look, to understand the proposal, the starting point is that the super rich today pay very little in tax. And we've seen that, for instance, in the US a few years ago when you had revelations by the US media ProPublica on the tax payments of Elon Musk, of Jeff Bezos, and in most years they paid almost zero income tax. And so that's not acceptable. And the simplest and most powerful solution to that problem would be for countries to agree basically on saying that there should be a floor that each and every year the super rich, let's say dollar billionaires, should pay a minimum amount of tax. Now for this to work, you have to base that minimum on something that's hard to manipulate. And income is very easy to manipulate by the super rich. They can create holding companies or trusts and so on. Wealth is much harder to manipulate. That's why it's very powerful to say, okay, the minimum tax is going to be equal to some fraction of your wealth, let's say 2% of your wealth. But one last point, to be very clear, the way to think about this minimum tax is not exactly as a wealth tax, because someone who already pays a lot of income tax, who pays more than the equivalent of 2% of their wealth in income tax, wouldn't have anything more to pay. It's just for people who pay very little income tax today that this minimum tax would be binding. In effect, it would operate as a kind of a top-up to the income tax to ensure that all the super rich pay in income tax at least 2% of their wealth each year.
Can I have a point of order? Sorry, we do
Go ahead,
points,
Ben.
we do points of order in South Africa in our parliament. How is it that the super rich, Gabriel, pay so little income tax? I mean, you think they've got a lot of money to pay tax from. How do these guys end up paying so little?
Well, fundamentally, because when you're very rich, it's easy to structure your wealth such that this wealth will generate very little or sometimes no taxable income. And there are two main ways to do that. One, you can instruct the companies that you own not to distribute dividends. And then you can also avoid realizing capital gains by holding onto your shares. And the second method is by using holding companies. Essentially, what the billionaires do is that they create shell companies. These shell companies are the nominal owners of their wealth, of their stakes in the businesses that they own. And it's these shell companies that receive dividend income shielded from the individual income tax.
So if we know how the super rich are able to get around taxation, why is it that the governments of the world have to date not been able to come up with a comprehensive response to stop that?
Well, great question. And that's because in practice, the main obstacle to taxing the super rich is the risk that they might move to relatively low tax countries. Even though the risk of such tax-driven mobility tends to be exaggerated in the public debate, it's a real risk, and the super wealthy have been very good at agitating that threat. And that's why international coordination is so valuable, because if we agree on a common floor, well, there would be no place for the super rich to hide.
So are you suggesting, Gabriel, that it's all basically a boogeyman scenario, if you will, the idea that if indeed such a tax were implemented, the super wealthy would go more offshore, go into the tax havens and that space? And can anything be done where these tax havens are concerned? What are the chances
Mars?
they would sign on?
What about Mars? They might get in a spaceship to Mars.
I mean, with the prices on this planet, I might go to Mars.
Does your proposal extend to Mars?
Yeah, look, it's a very important question. So what's important to understand is that there's a lot that countries can do on their own to better tax the super rich. So it's just not true that nothing can be done unless we have a truly global agreement. Any country like South Africa or like the US or India or France could say, look, we are going to increase the taxation of our own billionaires, and we also can take measures to make it harder for them to hide their assets in tax havens or to move their residency in tax havens. So for instance, very concretely, South Africa could say, well, if we have a super wealthy person who decides to move to Switzerland, let's say, to avoid paying taxes in South Africa, well, we will keep taxing that person after he or she has left. And we can do that for a number of years. After all, if you've become a billionaire in South Africa, that's in part because you've benefited from the education and the public goods of the country. And so there's just no legitimate right to, once you've become super rich, to move and to have no tax to pay anymore to South Africa. So there's a lot of things like that countries can do unilaterally.
Right.
At the same time, just to finish on that, at the same time, international coordination adds value because it creates an additional kind of backstop safety valve that makes it very hard, even harder for people to avoid taxation.
Wait a second. Tutu asked for this. Tutu, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, I think it was in
the late 2000s, early 2010s, when he suggested that there be a proposal, there be a taxation, in fact, of the uber rich in South Africa. But that never went anywhere, Lebo. Is that because the government is unwilling to tax the super rich?
So I think one of the things that is interesting is to look at what is the neoliberal way of looking at, how you drive the economy. And there has been this, I think it started with Gear or whatever, where it's like, let's live business alone and let's rather concentrate on a trickle-down approach. And this trickle-down approach suggests that, first and foremost, it's ahistorical. We never ask how was this wealth amassed in the first place, but also we believe that the state, if it tinkered with the super wealthy, it's going to basically, mess around with the markets.
So they'll take their money and run has been the threat.
Yes, but also just the economy, investment. The poor in this dominant neoliberal narrative is that they are very scary. And that is why whether you are talking about taxing the super rich or you are talking about how you ought to spend even the taxation that is there when you talk about the basic income grant, etc. Everybody has characterized the ones that are super wealthy, even middle class in some instances, not even the super wealthy, as legitimate, and the poor as, they just want to stay at home and sleep and be lazy and not do anything. And that narrative is dangerous because, as I said, it's ahistorical and it has proven not to work. We are sitting right now with a disaster that is caused by the inequality. We saw what COVID did, where within a week, many households in South Africa, while we took a scientific approach for everybody to stay at home, many families in the first week of COVID went to bed hungry because we've got a racialized in South Africa, fragmented and historically racist economic system. And part of this within South Africa is also going to be about how are we transforming an economy? Because equity, by the way, the basic definition of equity is distributing the burdens and the benefits of a society equally.
Wait.
Interesting.
We need to test this. We need to test whether it's racialized. Can we put up a picture of the five
richest
$5 billion? These are the $5 billionaires. I'm sure it's not racialized.
Well, there's only one black man. You can't get more racialized.
And where are the women?
And where are the women? It's gendered, it's racialized. So
absolutely.
To what extent then would what Gabriel is proposing in this report, Lebo, be able to address that?
Well, I think it's one solution in a sense that it will allow countries. And by the way, South Africa is very good at collecting taxes. I mean, of all the problems that we have in South Africa, tax collection, revenue collection is not one of them. However, the state is unable to meet some of the social public goods that are about equitable distribution of wealth when we don't have these taxes. And that is problematic.
Ben, you want to play Guess the Billionaire or Name the Billionaire?
So that guy on the left there, I want to introduce Gabriel Zucman to our dollar billionaires because he's got a proposal to tax them. So
we don't have a lot of them, but they've got a lot.
Yeah, I want him to meet them. So on the left is Kus Becker. I know him. So he made his money by having we're trying to test this proposition that they didn't, work hard enough for their wealth, and they built it on the back of, so he built his money partly on a monopoly in satellite television and advertising, which was a deal he did with the apartheid government. I'm sure that was perfectly fair and legitimate, that he should be the only guy in South Africa to do entertainment services under apartheid. So he had a monopoly as a result of a deal with the government, and then invested his money in Tencent in China and multiplied it by, 100 or 1,000 by doing what the Chinese government wanted him to do and not, sort of fighting with their regulation of the entertainment industry in China. Let's skip a couple of guys. We'll come back to them. But the one with the white beard, very famous.
Nicky Oppenheimer, yes.
So gold mining. Nothing wrong with gold mining. Gold mining never hurt anyone in South Africa. I mean, just, a few hundreds of thousands of miners, few millions of miners over the decades and century or more, gave their lives and their sweat, blood,
Blood, sweat and tears,
blood, sweat and
basically.
tears to the mining industry. But he walks away with some many billions of dollars. And the other guy, well, there's Patrice Motsepe. We'll let you talk about your views on Patrice, Lebo. The only black guy in the list. And then on the far right, the guy who set up Capitec Bank. Can't remember his name.
Mr. LaRue, is it? Yes.
Yeah.
They founded Capitec in the early 2000s. I think 2001 it was, when they came into the market as a bank that would ultimately be able to provide banking services to the poorer end of South African society. He's a billionaire providing a service for people who will never live the sort of life that he enjoys today.
So they all work really hard, Lebo. I don't think it's fair to say, that we should tax these guys, because they clearly, from looking at them, are people who worked really, really hard for their wealth.
Well, unless you know John Koch mines and you go into rural South Africa and you look at how the structure of the South African black family was permanently distorted by mining, then you will then say that mining and extractives have been beneficial and equitable. These are resources that are owned. They are under the belly of South Africa, but the benefit has been to individuals. And I do know that you are pulling our leg. Otherwise, I would have poured this beverage over your face. And I mean, one of the things that I think we are struggling with 30 years later after apartheid to address some of the very, very deep-rooted structural inequalities is that, and many people argue that when we negotiated a political settlement, we left, again, this free economy, that it will sort itself out. It's like gender equity. Well, let's fight for a seat at the table. But was the table meant for everybody? It's very, very interesting. And I guess also, the idea that you will only have one black man who sits there and talk about it as, transformation. We need to ask ourselves whether it is enough, particularly in a country like South Africa.
And I want to talk to Zimbali now, because Zimbali, you're a researcher in budget and tax policy. You've heard what Professor Zucman is suggesting, right? And Lebo talks about transformation, addressing the levels of inequality in South Africa. To what extent are the proposals in this report a sharp enough instrument to help South Africa deal with its very clear problems of inequality and the lack of economic transformation?
No, thanks for the opportunity. I think we all agree we need to tax the super rich. And I think this proposal from Prof. Zucman is an important intervention, especially given that South Africa is also going to be chairing the G20 next year. And so we need to build on this work to ensure that South Africa takes over from Brazil in pushing forward the momentum, which has already started. For instance, in the UN Tax Convention, we're hearing that there are conversations to actually bring about what Prof. Zucman touched on earlier, which is an international framework that will help countries enforce and coordinate their actions towards taxing the super rich. So I think this is an important step forward, but it's a technical resource that needs to be followed through by political action, because in South Africa, what we've seen is that we've made a lot of rhetorical statements. Even the minister, sorry, not the president, Enoch Godongwana has supported this initiative, penning a peace with some of the other finance ministers in the G20. But domestically, just to finish this point, domestically, we're still seeing that there's still that lack of political will to put forward these bold proposals, such as the one that Prof. Zucman is putting forward. So we need to work the domestic level together with the international level to ensure that we raise the resources.
How do you work that when you consider that the picture has changed so much in the last 4 weeks, right? Enoch Godongwana from the ANC was the finance minister in the last administration, but now he comes back, yes, as finance minister, but now there's an extra layer of negotiation and deliberation because he comes back as a finance minister with a weakened ANC and a government of national unity, where some of the parties actually aren't necessarily on the same page as far as economic policy and transformation.
Yeah, I mean,
what now?
You said, we all agree we need a wealth tax, Zimbali. Does John Steenhuisen agree that we need a wealth tax? Does,
Can I say something here? I think we were in a false comfort zone, thinking that a stronger ANC was pro-left. Left politics left the ANC even before they lost a majority, because talk is cheap. All of their policies from Mbeki's era were neoliberal. And
so you
I think
expect
one
more
of
of the same
things-
now?
But I want to say, these conversations, these reports, the partnerships with civil society movements, and that is the only reason why Oxfam and Oxfam internationally and Oxfam South Africa is backing this up. We need to stop making economics as something that is a myth out there. We need to be breaking down these numbers. I mean, the explanation from Prof. Zucman about how much they pay and how they evade tax. There is no moment like now in South Africa where the contestation of even who is in this,
This government of national unity, yes.
Absolutely. And I think there is a moment now, and we shouldn't let the ANC now tell us, when they couldn't do it with their majority, tell us that now they are weakened because they are with others. They have not been leftist in a long time, and it is the role of civil society, particularly when they are weak, to make sure that they shift the needle.
I see, Ben, but Zimbali, you were actually going to respond to my question. I'll come to you in a moment, Ben, about whether it makes a difference or not that we now have a government of national unity as far as South Africa's ability and interest in taking the mantle from Brazil and keeping the momentum on this proposal.
Yeah, I mean, there are challenges and opportunities. I'll start with the challenges. The challenge is that we know that the DA has put forward some very conservative policies, including opposing initiatives such as the wealth tax and putting forward proposals such as scraping the national minimum wage and so on. And so we should be worried that there is now a deputy minister in the finance office that comes from the DA, and we should question what sort of policies that is going to bring about. But I also take Lebo's point that the government that we are coming from, the sixth administration, in which ANC was the majority, has been implementing austerity budgeting, which is essentially cutting expenditure, and that has resulted in where we are today, where we are having a lack of access to public services and people's socioeconomic rights being abused. And so we should see it as an opportunity as well to say there are, contestations in this GNU, and potentially, like Lebo said, this is where we need to intensify our efforts at a national level and more importantly, at an international level, because when you look at the Africa group, the states that are putting forward the positions to say we need to have an international framework where we discuss international tax issues. They can't be just some issues that are discussed by the OECD, which historically has been known to represent the voices of a few rich countries in the world.
Right.
Yeah.
Ben?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, Lebo, to characterize the ANC as already neoliberal. I love your phrase, the left left the ANC some time ago. But they do spend, the government, the ANC, up until now, ANC-led government, does spend a couple of trillion rands every year on education, health. I think they're still the biggest budget items.
Social services.
Social services. And the tax base is everybody when it comes to VAT, but when it comes to income tax, it is the wealthiest South Africans. So there is redistribution on fairly large scale going on within the sort of South African system. Not enough, you might argue. I'm not trying to pull your leg anymore. No, for real, I'm not, Lebo.
No, you are correct.
Wait, and not enough. But I'm just saying the basis is there. If there was more tax, and if it wasn't looted, if it wasn't stolen by politicians, I know another issue dear to your heart, there's the basis for the government budget to be used to deliver better services to the majority of the population. I wanted to ask Gabriel a question. Have you met any billionaires recently? Do you meet billionaires? And what do they think about your proposal? Billionaires or presidents, for that matter? Because it'd be quite interesting to see what their sort of vibe is, in the corridors of the World Economic Forum. I'm not sure if you visit places like that. But what do they feel about your proposal? And what do you say to them, or anyone who sort of is linked to them, if they say, Gabriel, we're not very keen on your ideas. Can't you, find the money somewhere else?
So, look, first, at the political level, there is momentum for this idea. In February, Brazil, that has the presidency of the G20 this year, put that issue on the agenda. It was the first time ever that these questions were discussed in such forums. And in just a few weeks, a number of finance ministers have come out publicly expressing support for such an approach. And more broadly, most countries at the G20, I was there in São Paulo at the end of February, praised Brazil for putting that issue on the agenda. And they said, well, that conversation was long overdue. And so at the political level, there is progress which reflects the overwhelming popular demand for such measures. We're talking about forms of taxation that are supported by 70, 80% of people pretty much everywhere. We have opinion polls in all countries that show this huge demand for more tax progressivity. Now, for billionaires, look, we shouldn't be naive. Most billionaires hate it, and they will hate it, and they will fight against such measures. And they have good reason to hate that type of taxation. It would be the one form of taxation that would actually work to make them pay taxes. And as a class, they are very eager to defend their interests. And they will do what they do all the time. They will use the media. They will try to lobby policymakers to oppose these measures. Now, that being said, there are also some billionaires, but to be honest, very few of them, who are a bit smarter than that, and they understand that the current situation is not sustainable, and eventually, in the long run, is even not really in their own interest. Because look, a situation where the wealthiest people, those with the highest ability to pay taxes, those who have most benefited from globalization, are allowed to pay less tax than their secretaries, than school teachers, than firefighters, that's just not going to be sustainable. That's not going to continue forever. And in particular, global economic integration will come to an end if it's a synonym of ever lower taxes for its main beneficiaries and higher taxes for the rest of the population.
So, Gabriel, the thing with your proposal is, while there may be support across the world where especially poor and working class people say, actually, the rich should pay more, ultimately it would be up to individual countries to decide whether it's a route they want to take. And given the influence and the sometimes uncomfortable, perhaps even incestuous relationship between the politicians and the wealthy, what are the chances that this will become a reality?
Look, I think ideally you would like this proposal to be implemented in all countries, but it's not going to happen for a variety of political and geopolitical reasons. But what's important to understand is that you don't need global participation. You don't need a global consensus for this type of ideas to work in practice. What you need is a critical mass of countries willing to step forward to implement this minimum tax. And then what they should say is the following. They should say, look, we're going to tax our billionaires, and we will also tax the billionaires of other countries if those billionaires are undertaxed there. We will collect the taxes that other countries choose not to collect. That's exactly how it works. Some of you might know that there is a minimum tax for multinational companies of 15%. 130 countries agreed to that tax in 2021. It started to be implemented in about 35 countries in 2024. And in that agreement, you have mechanisms like that you could call tax collector of last resort mechanisms that say, essentially, look, the countries that apply the agreement have the right to overtax the multinationals and perhaps tomorrow the billionaires of non-participating countries. And that's very powerful because first, it provides incentives to all countries to join such an agreement. And second, it ensures that even if some countries don't join the agreement, the billionaires of these countries, they will also have to pay their fair share of tax.
I want to propose a subtitle for your report, Gabriel. You could call it "No Place to Go."
No place to go.
No place left to go. Can we put up a chart? Because I wanted to sort of re-talk about this thing of the redistribution in South Africa. We could have this conversation. So I crunched a few numbers. So the richest 5 South Africans, those guys you saw before looking a little bit lacking in pigment, the richest 5 South Africans have $25 billion US. A lot of zeros there. I hope I counted them correctly, which is 450 billion rands. I think that's about a quarter. So their total wealth is like a quarter of the South African government annual budget, if I'm not mistaken. And I worked out that you could pay for 1 million teachers and nurses' salaries for 3 years. Can I expand a bit? Do you want to know what else it would
Tell us
pay
more.
for?
What else could we get for 450 billion rand?
Well, actually, you know what I did next is to do Gabriel's calculations. So you want to tax them 2%, right? 2%. So 2% of 450 billion is 9 billion. So we're not planning to take all of their wealth, right, to fund teachers and nurses. So you could fund 62,500 teachers and nurses for 1 year.
Which we desperately need, right?
Which we desperately need. Which I worked out is 3,500 teachers and nurses, I've got a spelling mistake, sorry, per province. Or if you want to break it down a different way, 3,500 teachers and nurses per province and 4,000 grants of 125,000 per province, so 4,000 per province for young entrepreneurs. Would it ever get spent that way, Zimbali, Lebo? Would it all just get stolen by somebody before it gets there?
Look, I mean, as I said earlier, I think one of the departments that does a very, very good job, and that's the point that you made, Ben, earlier, is the one around SARS. And I want to believe that this is one measure that we have, but it must be accompanied with strengthening governance and accountability, which doesn't happen. But I want to introduce something else around, for me, why this tax is important. And that is the disaster that we are collectively facing due to climate change. And, there are so many mechanisms where we are asking for funds, like the Loss and Damage Fund and other funds that are going to mitigate the risks to climate change. And what climate change will do, assume that you've got your 25 billion and you are happy and you can move to Mars. But I think some of the bigger wars in the world are going to be caused by the displacement due to climate by climate disasters. And there is also a social contract that we need to have about climate justice. And in fact, one of the things that is absolutely that cannot continue is that the world's richest 1% are responsible for more carbon pollution than the poorest 5 billion people. And it is those 5 billion people who are going to suffer the most.
And the problem exactly that, isn't it?
Yes.
That it's one thing that multinationals and their CEOs and their boards actively participate in the destruction of the environment, but when disaster strikes, it is often the poor who are unable to get away in time, if get away at all.
Yes, but we are at a point with climate change right now where the instability, and we are facing it in Southern Africa. So the idea that there are benefits in acting in solidarity with each other. Look at what was the firelighter in this year's elections in South Africa. It was xenophobia. I say xenophobia is a victim-blaming word when in fact we are speaking about displacement. We are speaking about countries in Southern Africa, and I'm only going to talk about Southern Africa, not able to hold each other accountable in terms of governance, not able to lobby hard around how you deal with inequality across our borders, and all of those problems. You can't say, we are the 5 super rich and we don't care what's happening in Zimbabwe. We don't care what's happening in other places. In Johannesburg, we've had a water crisis, So there are some disasters that, even if you don't want to look at this text, are going to say, what is our collective responsibility? And I do believe that it is not a matter of if, it's a matter of when big wars are going to be caused by displacement. And I often say this, we can close our gates and think that the poor are fine and we can hide our money, but we are going to get to a point where the poor start eating us because there is nothing left if we don't really think about what are some of the disasters around economic, and ecological disasters that we are facing.
We're told investors want stability, but it can't be long-lasting stability in a country where people are increasingly poor, right? We caught a glimpse of that and how it was manipulated in 2021 with the July riots, because a lot of those people were mobilized because people feel so disenfranchised.
Yeah, absolutely. And those are the real arguments about how are we creating a world that is less unequal.
Zimbali, yes, I'd like to bring you in because, in fact, one of the things you as the IEJ said late last year was that park just taxing the billionaires more. You want even people who make just under R1 million, for example, we must do away, you were saying, with tax breaks for people who are in the 750,000 Rand category. So are we not letting them off the hook, some of the other wealthy people, by just focusing on the billionaires? Seems there's much more room, in fact, to collect more taxes, even from the multi-millionaires.
Yeah, definitely. I think it speaks to the point I want to make, which is that thanks to Ben for crunching the numbers. Makes my jobs very, very easy. But it just goes to show the importance of complementarity between the proposal that Prof. Zucman is putting on the table and the extent to the revenue that it can provide for South Africa. It's simply a good start, but it should be bolstered by a complementary and innovative taxes. And last year, like you say, we raised a number of additional taxes, including removing existing rebates on retirement fund contributions. We said you can also look at broadening, for instance, the financial transaction tax, which you have as the STT at the moment, which is currently levied at 0.25%. But if you just slightly increase that to 0.3%, you could raise 1.5 billion more, right? And if you look at the financial transaction tax and you widen the base of goods that are taxed there, at just 0.1%, you could raise an extra 40 billion. And so these are some of the additional taxes we think that there is still scope for and to consider in South Africa. And I think that we need to confront this conversation. And whilst we're making these progressive proclamations at an international stage, what else can we use at our disposal at the domestic level to levy the taxes on high-income earners and also the wealthy?
I like Lebo's metaphor. I'm sorry, when you release the next version of the report, Gabriel, you might need a film to accompany it. I'm a filmmaker. I'd love to make the film of the next version of the report, and we'll call it "Tax the Polluters to Save the Planet."
Yeah. Rich polluters must pay.
Rich polluters must pay. I mean, as you said, the rich are the main polluters. Yes. Do you have views? I mean, I wanted to ask you, Gabriel, you got to sell this proposal. It's got to be popular, to the maximum audience. That's why you'll need a film, of course. Do you put in your proposals or any of the work that you're doing what the money should be used for, not just, how to collect it? And do you look beyond billionaires? Is it only about dollar billionaires? Or as Zimbali said, in South Africa, it's very attractive to go beyond dollar billionaires. If you've got $100 million in South Africa, you're pretty damn rich.
Absolutely, yes. I want to echo what Zimbali said. That is, we have to go beyond billionaires, of course. And first of all, in the report, I start with billionaires because it's convenient. It's a small population. It's 3,000 individuals globally, a really tiny population of massively undertaxed individuals. So if you start with that segment of the population, you can quite easily collect a lot of tax revenue, $250 billion annually at the global level. Their wealth is highly visible. It's mostly shares in companies. And so it has all these advantages. But that being said, it's an arbitrary threshold. And the report also describes, what would happen if you extended the tax to people with more than $100 million in net wealth. For instance, in the US, President Biden, he has a billionaire minimum income tax proposal, which actually is pretty similar to what I propose in my own report. And that also starts, in fact, at $100 million in net wealth. And the third thing is, even if you had this coordinated tax on centimillionaires, you would like to have additional measures at the domestic, at the national level, exactly like Zimbali mentioned, to increase tax progressivity on a broader segment of the population. Why? Just because we have such massive revenue needs for education, for providing high quality education for all, for healthcare, for public infrastructure, for the fight against climate change. All of these forms of public spending are going to be a key, perhaps the most important engine of economic growth and social progress in the 21st century. And so to answer your question, the report is squarely focused on taxation. It's already complicated to get to an agreement on creating a common minimum tax. But of course, there is a very important discussion to have about how the revenues could be spent. And just like taxation, these are issues that are to be decided not by experts, but by the people through democratic deliberation and the vote.
And that comes to what we were talking about earlier, especially with you, Lebo, about whether if this went ahead and this was all implemented, great, it would go to education, healthcare, social services. But in reality, countries like South Africa, and we're not the only ones, there's a massive concern around that money never reaching the people who so desperately need it.
Absolutely.
In South Africa, Gabriel, in the last decade and a half, there was an issue, in fact, a report that says even the revenue collector, SARS, was targeted by people who were basically messing with the state with corrupt intent. So how do we insulate the institutions domestically that would ultimately help us reach the goal?
We just need you to solve a few more problems for us here in South Africa, if you don't mind.
Look, the effectiveness of public spending, can be improved in South Africa, in all countries, to be honest. But you also have to compare with the effectiveness of private spending. You have corruption in the private sector as well. You have inefficiencies there. So I think, look, if you take the big picture, historical, long view, what you realize when you do that is that what's been historically the main driver of social progress, of economic growth, has been mass investment in human capital, in education, in healthcare, and in public infrastructure. And I think this is still going to be the case in the 21st century.
And to that point, one of the things you say is that there are still gaps in international information exchange and in the identification of the beneficial owners of assets. And you have to wonder, given the context that we're talking about corruption and the evasion of tax, how much of that is deliberate?
I'm sure some of it is. What I want to stress is that, sometimes there is this view that you cannot do anything against tax evasion. It's some kind of law of nature, or corruption, or the inefficiency of government spending. We're just powerless. But that view is wrong. Look, for instance, at what has happened with tax evasion. 10 years ago, it was really easy for wealthy people to hide assets in offshore financial centers with very strong bank secrecy. And in 2018, more than 100 countries started to automatically exchange bank information. They created a new transparency standard, a new form of international coordination that was deemed utopian 10 or 15 years ago. And look, it's not perfect, but it is making a real difference in the sense that it has become significantly harder for wealthy people to hide assets in Switzerland or in the Cayman Islands because of this information exchange system. And so what we can do is we can build on that. It's a progress, but it's still insufficient. We can make it better by including other forms of wealth like real estate, by creating new transparency on the ownership of multinational companies. But fundamentally, what's important to understand is that tax evasion is not a law of nature. It's a policy choice. Sometimes we choose to facilitate it, to encourage it, and sometimes we can choose collectively to create new forms of coordination to fight it.
We need the right role models and we need the right vibe, right? Because one of the biggest tax evaders in the world is Donald Trump, we're led to believe. So if we don't have the right role models running the country, then we're not going to have action by people that, we're going to have support for this kind of a proposal. Yeah. We were having this conversation the other day, you remember, about whether people in South Africa believe in tax. I don't know if you remember, I'm a bit old, but I remember these SARS adverts that used to come on TV where you would see somebody like riding a bicycle on a road with no potholes, and you would see somebody drinking a glass of very clean water, and it would say, tax funds this stuff, pay your tax. And I remember thinking, I'm going to pay my tax because tax is being used for all this good stuff. At the moment in South Africa, there's this vibe that tax is being stolen by politicians.
Unfortunately, and I do think that, like many things, you are going to have a multi-pronged approach, because once the narrative and the popular narrative is going to be, how are these taxes going to be used? How are you going to measure whether or not this money is going to go to the right people? When we see people who we know through the Zondo Commission have stolen and are not being brought to book, even the idea that you are going to be able to collect more taxes is not going to win. But more importantly is the good old word in South Africa of service delivery. So we do collect tax amongst, it's a wonder how we calculate who's wealthy in South Africa, because the bar is low. But after paying tax, they've got to provide their own security, their own health, their own education, because the state has failed in so many issues. And because of rampant unemployment, many people are supporting 4 or 5 households out of what the government has done. So there is a case to be made around how is governance for the areas where this text must go. And it's going to be a difficult message to send. I think the sadness of it is if we are going to throw away with the bathwater and say, don't talk tax because it's not used very well. Because in fact, there are people whose livelihoods, if you look at the tax, the social security in Africa, South Africa has the largest, and you look at what people have done or old gogos are doing with their old age pension, it shows you just what a social protection that it can be. So we can't afford to have binary conversations about it's either this or that. It's not black and white. However, it does not take away from the state also being extremely accountable with the tax that it collects.
So tax is cool. Tax is cool. Tax is very cool, and we need to go and talk. Are there any young people here? There's no young people.
I think Zimbali and I might be the youngest people here.
I'm young at heart, okay?
Maybe we need to go out into the streets.
With the tech.
But I think... The important point that Lebo was making is it's very easy, right, in South Africa and in other countries to sort of become pessimistic or cynical. But the reality is daily we see the work that taxation does in this country. That is why, as you were saying, pensioners are able to receive an old age grant. That is why there's a 350 Rand grant, because that's why feeding schemes are there for in the education space, right? But ultimately, it's very hard to convince people who don't feel the benefit.
But let me add another thing. I think this is where, for me, international comparison is going to be important. So in South Africa, because of the inequality that we have had historically, we know what happened before 30 years ago. But it's now created the narrative that governments are corrupt. The private sector is perfect. Go to Europe. Go to so many other countries. Those countries work because they collect high taxes, but the difference is that they then know how to turn them into a global good. So the narrative also needs to say, if collected and if applied well, it can be something that we all enjoy, And so I think there is that comparison for me is going to be, because in fact, the people who make a lot of noise about tax are the middle class and historically non-black people.
She looked in my direction.
Well, hang on. Let's look in your direction, just out of interest. Do you, when you talk to like friends and stuff, Thembekile, do you like curse taxation? Do you like, you're doing your tax return and you're like, I resent how much I have to...
Not at all. In fact, one of my biggest frustrations in South Africa when we talk about the poor and, in fact, the collapse of certain public services is how easy it is, to what Lebo was saying. The middle class will say, well, I'm a taxpayer. We're all taxpayers. Even the poorest person.
Yeah.
If you are going into a superstore,
you pay VAT.
If you're going to a supermarket to buy something, you're a taxpayer, right? So I don't think the issue is that people don't want to pay tax. I've got a friend who's even said, she wishes that if we're in a situation where we've accepted that people will be corrupt, just get the work done. Make sure that the poor are covered. Because what happens is people feel as though there's this pot of money, but the majority of it, not necessarily true, disappears, and that's why they feel
it's not
pessimistic.
The majority. But we've got to correct that, because it isn't the majority.
It isn't the majority.
It's nowhere near the majority. I mean, I just want to put it out there.
Yeah.
So the South African government spends I'm the figures guy on this podcast. So the South African government spends 2-point-something trillion rands on public services, and what is all of the state capture added together might have been some numbers of billions of rands. So it is a small fraction.
It's a misconception.
But I want to come back to what you said. You see, for me, I also and I'm a stickler for narrative. Okay, I think we need to be thinking about how every citizen will benefit from taxation that is applied well. I'm a woman in South Africa. I want to know that if anything was to happen to me, firstly, I want to know that when I drive home, there will be enough street lighting and I will be able to get home safe. Proper taxation, proper use of taxation can do that. Not what we are paying in private security. So we need to dispel this myth. I want to make sure that if I was to fall ill and I was to call an ambulance, I will not be asked if I've got medical insurance or not. So it is also for my benefit that the public health system works. I want to make sure that I'm not jumping all the schools around me, like some of the middle-class families in Soweto, where the kids will leave at 4 a.m.
They're bussed out of townships.
They are bussed out of town.
Because the schools are no good.
Because the schools are no good. Yeah. So part of what we need to do, and I think that is sometimes why the middle-class conversations are frustrating for me, is that there is this notion that you can, just because you took my tax, something else is going to happen. There is some active citizenship about how do we improve what happens with the taxes that is important, that is very, 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 very vital as well, for our own benefit, because I do think that all of us are about self-preservation. So before you tell me about somebody poor,
it's what I'm saying,
deal
right?
with my needs.
People don't realize, people get frustrated when they don't personally benefit from a system. We've got two tax experts with us, thankfully, and I want to ask you both, Gabriel and you, Zimbali, and I'll start with you, Zimbali. How do we address the issue of tax pessimism at the most basic level?
Yeah, I think Lebo has touched on it. The positive messaging is one important element to do to show the potential value which tax can bring about in society. But of course, you can't divorce that from the governance issues which we are faced with in the country. And so ultimately, we need to marry the positive messaging and showing the potential value both in rands and the transformative value of what tax can do for our country. Marry that with a good government ethics and setting a bare minimum for our, government as to what are the standards that we want as South Africans to be delivered. But I want to also ask Gabriel a question. I don't know if you can ask now or should I wait for you?
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, it's just around, the proposal says that it's not necessary for it to be globally enforced, or rather for groups to agree that it should be enforced. I'm not sure if I understand that correctly. Like, how do we implement that or enforce it to ensure that a sufficient number of states are participating in order for us to draw revenue? And then added to that is the question around the UN tax convention. Do you see this as something that is outside of that, or in the long term, are we going to have something that is moved towards the UN from this proposal?
Gabriel?
I very much hope it will be taken up by the UN. I think what's happening at the UN is extremely important, and the vote that happened last year for the beginning of a discussion to create a framework convention on taxation is essential. We need to discuss these issues of taxation in a truly inclusive manner, and that's not been the case in the past, where the OECD had a kind of monopoly on these discussions, and the OECD, has done some good work, but also fundamentally represents just 38 high-income countries and doesn't represent the interest of the billions of people of the global south. So I really hope that this conversation will continue at the UN, and more broadly that the future will be different from the past, in the sense that in the future we will have different international organizations involved, not just the OECD, but also the UN or other bodies, could take a useful part in all of that. And then how to make the proposal work if some countries don't join the agreement? Well, the idea is the following, billionaires, they themselves have assets everywhere, or they spend some of their time in different countries. And so these countries, can tax them to some extent. But also more fundamentally, you have to understand that the wealth of the super rich essentially derives from their ownership of companies, of multinational companies. These companies, they have assets and employees and customers everywhere in South Africa, in Brazil, in France. And so even if their owners live in the US, let's say, those countries could say, well, look, if you don't pay enough tax in the US, we are going to make you pay more here in South Africa or in Brazil or in France.
Ben?
I think we're getting to the end of Reality Check. I would like to guess that we may be the only 1, 2, 3, 4 South Africans sitting today getting excited about taxation. And you did it to us, Gabriel. So I have this vision of this Frenchman traveling the world, getting groups of people in every country.
The tax messenger.
The tax messenger. I love it. So we really like you, tax messenger. We like your proposal in this room. We're going to try to spread the word. It's a little bit of a difficult audience to spread it to, particularly when you listen to the finance journalists in South Africa. They're not really looking for more taxation, they're looking for less. But we'll try.
And we're almost out of time. I think we've got about, 2 minutes or so on the clock. Lebo, as we conclude then, we're waiting to see how much momentum this report will get and whether it actually becomes something that countries support. What would be the cost if that doesn't happen?
Further inequality and further instability. And I think it's going to be much more expensive to erode some of the problems that inequality breeds. Countries are also drowning in debt, and I think we haven't spoken enough about debt and what it means for countries that are implementing these austerity measures, are taking from the IMFs of this world and are meant to be paying for this debt, and what it will take. But we will be so far away from our transformation goals, particularly in South Africa, because the economy is not transformed enough to accommodate everybody in South Africa. And that is the promise that even the most conservative politicians in South Africa is making to the citizens. And very soon, sins in Kenya are going to be all over if we don't address some of these fundamental issues.
I was going to say, social collapse, uprising.
Social collapse, absolutely.
And just briefly, Gabriel, so we're all able to track what happens next. What should we expect as far as the journey of this report in the coming months?
Look, the conversation is just starting. Nobody expects that this minimum tax on the super rich is going to happen in a few weeks. You know, these things, they take years. It took 9 years for the minimum tax on multinationals to become a reality. That time around, I hope it will be quicker than that, in part because we can build on the progress that was made over the last years. So, you know, I would expect some progress in the next 2 to 3 years. And I don't think we can wait. We can afford to wait any longer, because the risk is really to see, a further acceleration in the concentration of wealth. With the concentration of wealth comes the concentration of power, of political power, of economic power, and that's a real threat, for democracies everywhere.
Professor Gabriel Zucman, so good to speak to you, as well as you, Zimbali Mncube from the IEJ, and of course, Lebo Ramafoko, who's the director, in fact, executive director at Oxfam South Africa, and of course you, Ben Cashdan, executive producer of Reality Check, and for myself, Thembekile Mrototo. Hopefully, next time that we're back with you, there'll be better news on the inequality front as South Africa grapples with that major challenge that has persisted and in fact got worse over 3 decades. We'll see you soon.